Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lisa Honecker. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities, and I would like to welcome you today to our second in a series of webinars on called Continuing the Conversation, Race, Racism, and Anti-Racism. This series, speaker series, which we're running throughout this year. Ooh, I keep disappearing. Had its origins in a seminar, a webinar over the summer sponsored by Temple University. The Department of Africology and African American Studies hosted Race, Racism, and Anti-Racism, Redefining the Social Contract. That event featured 22 Black scholars, including our own, Pat Reed Merritt, who gave 10-minute presentations in their area of expertise. Dr. Molefi Asante, who coordinated that webinar, was very enthusiastic about our efforts to continue it, and he was our first speaker. Now, our speaker today, Dr. Jermain McCalpin, was not part of that initial conversation, but the topics on which he is an expert and on which he presents regularly, reparations, is very much a part of that conversation. And so we are delighted to have him here today as part of our series sponsored by Africana Studies and the School of Arts and Humanities. And I want you to know now that Dr. Kamika Murphy, Assistant Professor of Historical Studies, will be introducing Dr. McCalpin. So Kamika, take it away.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I hope everyone can hear me. It gives me absolute great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jermain McCalpin. Dr. McCalpin is a widely respected reparations and genocide scholar who currently teaches African and African American studies at New Jersey City University. He is an alumnus of the University of the West Indies, the light rising from the West, where he completed his bachelor's and master's of science degrees in political science and international relations. Dr. McCalpin also holds an MA and PhD in political science from Brown University. Among his many areas of research, Dr. McCalpin is internationally recognized for his expertise in African political philosophy, the Armenian genocide, the transatlantic trade in Africans, especially as it relates to transnational justice and truth commissions. As an academic and consultant, he has done significant work on reparations for historic injustice, political accountability, and commissions of inquiry. He's also published extensively on Caribbean political thought and restorative justice in the context of the African diaspora, African Americans, Native Americans, South Africa, and Armenia. We are honored to have Dr. McCalpin here with us today to talk about race, reparations, and justice in America. So then please join me in giving an Osprey's welcome to my friend, Dr. McCalpin.
Thank you very much, my dear friend, Dr. Kamika Murphy. I want to say good afternoon to everyone who is on the webinar. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the opportunity, Africana Studies and the College of Arts and Humanities, to present some of my work and some of the ongoing conversation regarding race and injustice here in America. Just to frame where I'm coming from, I want to do a historical overview and then to get to the contemporary. So please bear with me. I'll try to be done in half an hour to make time for questions. And some of the slides that I will use won't require much analysis or examination by you, the viewers and readers. So I want to start by sharing the screen, and I will go through. And if you have a question, feel free to ask that question at the end of the presentation. Thank you. So when we talk about reparations, I like to historicize the concept itself without just focusing on what we often talk about in the present. You know, when we talk about reparations, we tend only to focus on this idea of disbursements of monies. And reparations extends above and beyond monetary compensation. So when we get an image of reparations, I think of reparations far more diverse and comprehensive than this simplistic picture of reparations only as money. So when we talk about this idea of justice, I think reparations figures prominently in this conversation primarily because of how we understand justice. In talking about
My apologies, there seem to be some technical difficulties. We will be right back on in just a moment.
So in talking about reparations, I think something happened on the line a while ago. Let's resume. So I want to talk about basic definitions, racism, the types of racism, etc. So this talk is about understanding that the continuation of racial oppression and not just a historical focus on slavery of 150 years ago is where I think it is important to provide justification for reparations for slavery. Reparations are to be understood more than just monetary compensation. And third, racism, that I call the antecedent of slavery, has been institutionalized and continues to structure contemporary American relations. So we often think of racism and the question of slavery, as something bygone and past, and so reparations is moot because let bygones be bygones. Fourth, reparations have never been granted for the centuries of uncompensated black labor as well as the residual effect of the initial investment. In other words, one of the main arguments I want to make is that blacks received in 1863 emancipation without freedom. Fifth, oftentimes the unwillingness to understand reparations as important, it proceeds from this idea of unwilling to see the continuity of the past with the present through intermediate notions that institutional complicity help to account for what we deem an historic wrong. And sixth, support for reparations is not a racial compact. It is what justice demands for historic wrongs that have persisted through institutionalized racism. And I want us to be clear that when we talk about support for reparations, I find that both supporters and opponents share a very interesting commonality, and that is the disproportionate focus of reparations as financial disbursements or monetary compensation. I argue that reparations actually have 5 dimensions, and I'll talk about it in a little while. So I want to move to discussions concerning definitions. Interestingly, today, according to the Institute of the Black World, is the National Day of Action for Reparations. So it is quite serendipitous that on this day, the 19th of October, where we essentially advocate for reparations, is actually the day we're having this conversation regarding reparations. So I want to talk about HR 40. For those who know, or rather those who don't know, HR 40 has been introduced on the congressional floor in the House of Representatives for every legislative session from 1989, that would be the 101st Congress, until the current Congress, which is the 116th Congress. H.R. 40 is essentially a proposed bill to establish a committee to explore the historic and contemporary effects of slavery and whether compensation should be granted. Please note that it's not a reparations bill, but a bill to establish a committee to examine reparations. It has never left the House committee level, right? According to the government tracking of legislation, GovTrack, the prognosis is that H.R. 40 has a 4% chance of being passed, right? We see that reparations continues to languish as something of a fringe and radical perspective, when of a reality, I argue, it is something that justice demands of us. So I want to talk about racism, because we often use racism in such a very loose and languid way. I think of racism in a very important way. I think of racism as a global system of domination and oppression that normalizes privileges for white and emboldens prejudice against non-whites. So we are not just talking about now not liking someone because they are black or white or Asian. We are saying that racism is a system of domination. So to be clear, racial prejudice exists across races. However, racism is practiced by whites in a system that combines not only racial prejudice, but power. So racism is racial prejudice with power. In other words, power here is the ability to operate within a system that reproduces white privilege and non-white domination and oppression. So racism isn't just I don't like this person or that person. It is a system that normalizes white privilege and emboldens prejudice against non-whites. According to Joe Fegan, in the United States, racism is structured into the rhythms of everyday life. It is lived, concrete, advantageous for whites, and painful for those who are not white. Each major part of a black or white person's life is shaped by racism. And that is to talk about the pervasiveness of racism. Now, in my conversations with my students, but also with colleagues, we tend to conflate two notions or two categorizations of racism, and that is systemic and institutionalized. So I want to distinguish between these two, and then I want to talk about reparations. So what is systemic racism? According to Fegan, again, it includes the complex array of anti-black practices, the unjustly gained political and economic power of whites, the continuing economic and other resource inequalities along racial lines, and the white racist ideologies and attitudes created to maintain and rationalize white privilege and power. So in other words, systemic really means that the core manifestations of the system are inherently racist. So that's what we mean when we talk about systemic racism. The entire system, if we think of the body politic as a system, whether it's the endocrine, the digestive, all of the systems of the body politic are essentially infused with the lifeblood of racism. And for institutionalized racism, we go to perhaps the first formalized use of the term. This is by Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton in their very interesting and important book, Black Power in the Politics of Liberation in America. They define institutionalized racism as the patterns of racism built into this society's major institutions, the discriminatory patterns and practices involving much more than the actions of scattered white bigots. So in other words, we often want to talk about racism as it is only an institution, an individual practice, when Hamilton and Ture are essentially arguing that it is institutionalized. So we can think of a situation where that even if every racist person were to disappear from the face of the earth, we could still have racism. because it is built into the structure and the institutional framework of the entire United States. And so we have defined racism as a system of domination and oppression that maintains white privilege and power. In other words, racism is racial prejudice combined with power. So reparations. I define reparations as any kind of measures that are taken to make amends or to repair a historic wrong. It is important that that wrong may have happened in the past, or the wrong continues to persist primarily through institutional or the bequeathing of racism and its effects. In other words, reparations are acts or series of acts that are aimed at redressing some kind of wrong committed, normally by a state against its citizens or those of another country. So when we think of reparations here in this definition, what I wanted to make clear that you have seen nothing there to indicate that reparations is and can only be about monetary compensation. Certainly it involves monetary compensation, but that is only one of the 5 dimensions, I argue, of reparations. So what are the approaches to reparations, or the dimensions? First, there is an apology, right? Most people think that an apology is necessary for the crime of the genocide of African Americans here in the US, or of the native peoples. But for this purpose, we're talking about the context of reparations for slavery. So one approach to reparation is an apology, but an apology by itself is not self-standing as reparations. In other words, reparations have to be comprehensive enough that they include all of the 5 dimensions. So I can't just apologize for the ignominy of slavery or for the residual effects of slavery. That apology must be associated or accompanied by tangible acts of contrition. And that is the point of the Roy Brooks edited volume entitled When Sorry is Not Enough, right? Because it's important to say sorry, to apologize, even in a proxy sense, because often opponents of reparations say, well, I can't apologize for what I didn't do. But if we understand international relations, we know that there is institutional continuity across time because a country has existed for, in the case of America, 200 plus years. So whether or not you sign the Declaration of Independence or whether or not you sign the Emancipation Proclamation, you are expected to uphold the terms of such a compact. So the other dimensions, there are memorials and commemorations. Reparations also include tangible monuments and days of commemoration, dealing with the atrocity or dealing with the historic injustice that has to be repaired or compensated for. Third, land. Land is important to reparations. And blacks have still not received this 40 acre and a mule. And I'll talk about that later when I explore the terms of Field Order number 15, which was essentially ordered by then William T. Sherman, and we'll talk some more about that later. And fourth and obvious, monetary compensation. But if you are following, you will see that monetary compensation is only one dimension of reparations. So the fifth approach, historical rectification. I think in many ways the history of the US has to be told and taught in such a manner that it acknowledges the wrongs of enslavement and properly places the central role of blacks in America's development. In other words, for me, the proposal has been since 2012 for an American Truth and Reparations Commission. The first step to repair is an institutional apology, and that institutional apology, I argue, must be grounded in a Truth and Reparations Commission process. Greensboro, dealing with the treatment of the Greensboro in Greensboro, North Carolina, had a Truth Commission, and I argue that could certainly serve as a model in understanding the historical rectification that is necessary in dealing with reparations. In many ways, I think opponents of reparations for slavery heralded in 2008. I wrote this article for the Armenian Review in 2012. They heralded the election of Barack Obama for a very different reason. For them, it meant that if a black man had now ascended to the highest office in the country, it had muted the argument that blacks had continued to be marginalized and subjugated in America. In other words, for those opponents, the election of a black president canceled the need for reparations for slavery. And that argument, I argue, is not only procedurally weak, it is also historically inaccurate, given the reality that the conditions or the life situations of blacks didn't somehow rise to the level of parity just because there was a black president. So where have we seen reparations? I give 4 examples. There are many others. The maybe most obvious of the 20th century would be the German payment to Israel. So since the end of World War II, and as per the terms of the Nuremberg Agreement, after the Nuremberg trials, Germany has paid approximately $90 billion in reparations to Israel and Jewish organizations for its conduct and essentially the genocide of the Jewish people in the Holocaust between 1933 and 1945. Those payments ended in December 2017. I put gave because it's really in the second one, returning to the rightful owners. Australia gave its Aborigines 96,000 square miles of land in 1976, and the Tasmanian-based Aborigines were awarded a very paltry £2 million in 2008 because some argue that there was a distinct genocide of the Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples starting in the 1870s. Third, and maybe closer to home, is that the United States government under Ronald Reagan essentially gave reparations to Japanese Americans and their descendants who were interned during World War II. When the Japanese internment camps were set up as a direct and immediate response to the December 1939 bombing of Pearl Harbor, led to reparation payments for the victims who suffered. $20,000 was granted to each victim or to their descendants for a total of $1.6 billion. In June 2013, the British government awarded 5,200 Mau Mau freedom fighters from Kenya, again a paltry $21.5 million US dollars for the historic suffering meted upon them by the British. Now, what is the point? There is precedence for reparations both internationally as well as domestically, but no American government has thus far directly, explicitly, and I would argue justly taken on reparations for slavery. So there's a perception of reparations that, like I said, the election of a president muted it. And Senator Mitch McConnell's comments during, or rather at the end of the hearings on Capitol Hill in June 2019, this is what he said. We tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislations. We elected an African American president. Now, this reeks of tokenism, this idea that because you have a black executive, that mutes the need for long-standing reconciliation and rectification of historic injustice. And so I argue that while the election was momentous, that single action could not redeem the soul of America. The original sin of slavery has still not been compensated for, because the same civil war that was fought to, quote, end this original sin of slavery actually served to reinstitute notions of enslavement, because those who were given land, blacks who were given land in the wake of the end of the civil rights, were unceremoniously removed from those lands starting in October 1865, when President Andrew Johnson reverses the course agreed upon by Abraham Lincoln and W.T. Sherman. So what are the views of Americans on reparations? And I want to give one caveat, because in many ways even Gallup falls prey to this idea that reparations are only about money. This was the question that was asked by the Gallup polls, first in 2002 and then in 2019, 17 years apart. Do you think the government should or should not make cash payments to Black Americans who are descendants of slaves? So again, this idea that reparations is only cash. No apology, no memorialization, no historic rectification, no disbursement of land, cash payments. But let's look at what the figures say, and you will realize that support for reparations coalesce around racial and ethnic identifiers. 2019, June, was when the Gallup polls were done, and this was in the immediate aftermath of the judicial hearings on Capitol Hill concerning reparations. So if you look at the figures, you will see what is there, right? The national adults in 2019, 29% said should. In 2002, that was 14. So support for reparations almost doubled nationally in the 17 years. Clearly not significant, because it is still less than a third of Americans who support reparations. When you break down according to race, non-Hispanic whites, you will see again, 2002, only 6% argued that reparations should be granted. In 2019, 16%. Still less than 1/5 of all whites believe that reparations are a good idea. And this focusing only on cash payments. I honestly believe that if the understanding of reparation was more comprehensive, I think more persons would agree with what should be done for historic injustice. If you look at non-Hispanic blacks, you will see that the support, as expected, is significant. A little over half in 2002, but almost 3/4 of those polled of African Americans supported, or rather blacks to be more accurate, supported reparations for slavery. When we look along party lines, we will see that kind of identification. So you will see Hispanics generally are balanced across support and not supporting reparations. According to party ID, overwhelmingly, Republicans, or those who identified as Republicans, opposed reparations for slavery. Independents, a third of them support it, and almost half of those who identified as Democrats support reparations for slavery. So why do I think of reparations as justice? One of the main arguments I want to advance is that the central aspect of the advocacy for reparations for slavery is that the U.S., having been built primarily on the forced labor of the enslaved, never compensated them for their labor and enslavement. So in effect, in 1865, the former slaves therefore got emancipation, which is a political act, without freedom. Freedom is far more expansive. Freedom involves the ability to determine one's life course. That is economic, that is philosophical, that is religious, that is social, that is geographic, that is the ability to move and to live where one wants to. That has not been granted or received by blacks here in the United States. So what you have is emancipation without freedom. So in another sense, we can think of reparations as a debt. And Randall Robinson, one of the earlier proponents of this argument, makes this idea in his book, The Debt, What America Owes Blacks. I remember when I first read it, he was summarily dismissed by so many people of this $10 trillion figure. But here's a simple calculation. In 1860, the average price of an enslaved was $800. In 2011 value, that ranges between $17,000 and $266,000. The market value of the total slaves in 1860, and that was the last census before emancipation, was $3 billion. $3 billion multiplied into 2017 dollars totals $10 trillion. And I remember when this figure was posed by Robinson, people laughed and dismissed it. But I'll give you an interesting aside. On March 27, 2020, because of the effects and the economic fallout as a result of the COVID pandemic, the Congress of the United States approved stimulus payments to Americans and businesses across the U.S. totaling $2.7 trillion. This is for something that was a little over a month into operation, and yet still having removed from the political notion of slavery from 1865, no such thing has been granted to African Americans. And I want to move quickly because I know we are almost out of time. So what are some of the arguments that are made against slavery, against reparations for slavery? First, we get the idea, often paraded, very problematic because it is not historically accurate and expansive, that Africans sold other Africans into slavery. We are well aware of that. But Africans in Africa did not make lifelong slaves of other Africans. And in many ways, the trade in slaves was not controlled by Africans themselves, but by the Arabs and later the Europeans. So in many ways, slavery was not chattel or racialized. I've heard people argue that blacks need to get over this slavery business and take responsibility for their failures. But I love to point out that in many ways, those who were enslaved did not have the opportunity to transmit wealth across generations because they never had the initial investment to transfer this wealth. And so in many ways, those who are making that argument, whether directly or indirectly, have benefited from what I call whiteness capital. That is, just by virtue of being white, you have benefited from that privilege historically. The one that many persons love, I did not enslave or colonize anyone. I think philosopher Charles Mills puts it best. He says all whites may not have been signatories, that is, to the compact of slavery, but all whites have been beneficiaries. So whether or not you supported a system of slavery, you have benefited by virtue of being white. So it's not now to lay individual blame, but it is to lay a collective responsibility for the reality of slavery. Senator McConnell in 2019 said reparations for slavery are not a good idea and that no one currently alive was responsible for that. So again, it's making this argument that does not understand the continuity based on the survivability of institutions and structures. So if you have the same system of racism that established slavery still in effect, it doesn't matter whether or not you enslaved anyone. This was Joe Biden in the 1970s. I don't feel responsible for the sin of my father and grandfather. I feel responsible for what the situation is today, for the sins of my own generation, and I'll be damned if I feel responsible to pay for what happened 300 years ago. He said this in 2019, while the candidacy for the party, the Democratic Party, was still being worked out. But what do we see across political lines? This idea that because I was not directly there, I am not responsible. Here is my argument. If you can inherit wealth, you can also inherit responsibility. If you can inherit privilege, then you must inherit the liabilities that come with that. So we often hear that reparations are too divisive, and so it is not practical to do so. I want to talk here about when victims pay for reparations. In 1825, a little over 2 decades after gaining their independence, Haiti had to pay reparations to France in order to avoid its sovereignty being threatened by France. It took Haiti 122 years to pay off this debt that totaled $21 billion. So I want you to understand that there have been historic situations where the victims of oppression have had to essentially pay to offset the oppression that they freed themselves from. And we have now when slave owners receive reparations for slavery, and yes, they have. In 1834, the British West Indian planters received £20 million from the British government to compensate for the loss of forced labor. This figure today is worth $20 billion. Interestingly, the formerly enslaved received an additional 4 years of apprenticeship to prepare them for freedom. No monetary compensation, but further servitude to the white plantocracy. I love this case of ex-slaves. Belinda Sutton, a woman that was born in West Africa in 1783 in Massachusetts. She actually wins an award for reparations and becomes the first person in the U.S. on record to win a reparation award. The slave owner was Isaac Royal, a wealthy resident of Massachusetts. She was awarded £15, 12 shillings per year for 4 years, which approximately would be $12,000 per year. This is her claim. Her claim was that she was denied the enjoyment of that immense wealth, a part whereof had been accumulated by her own industry and the whole augmented by her servitude. Very important that this woman fought and won compensation. This is the actual, a copy of the actual document. What you may notice, if anything, are that those who signed it into law, approved and concurred by Samuel Adams, John Hancock, two of the men who were also two of the 57 who signed the Declaration of Independence. So we are back to Field Order 15, 40 acres, because the mule wasn't originally attached until later. In January 1865, William Tecumseh Sherman signed the order that confiscated lands and essentially said that these confiscated lands should be divided in 40-acre plots and given to those who were freed from slavery. By August 1865, 40,000 people had settled on over 400,000 acres, and they had begun to own and improve this for agriculture. But as you know, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Andrew Johnson succeeds him and essentially reverses the field order and returns the lands that were awarded to the freedmen back to the Confederate planters. Again, emancipation without freedom, because those black landowners and their families would now have to return to wage labor and would become trapped in a cycle of racial oppression. Interestingly enough, if you can imagine the multiplier effect of over 150 years, had those lands remained in the possession of black Americans here in the US. So I want to conclude here. I know we're out of time. And to make the argument that pro-reparations is not anti-white. Being pro-reparations is an articulation of being pro-justice. Peoples of all races and creeds need to support reparations for slavery. Therefore, reparations must be supported by those who love justice and work to see it rendered, whether or not the wrong happened 100 years ago or 400 years ago, right? What about the modern reparations movement? And quickly, I want to highlight a few. James Foreman delivers the Black Manifesto at Riverside Church, and he demands that churches, white churches, and synagogues who he says were complicit in slavery pay $500 million to blacks. In 1987, NCOBRA is founded, along James Foreman and others found NCOBRA. One of the largest advocacy groups for reparations. In 2003, an African-American lawyer, Deidre Farmer-Pellman, initiates lawsuits across 9 states against several companies with ties to slavery. Aetna, Fleet Boston, CSX Railroad, and Wachovia Bank. In 2003, Brown University President Ruth Simmons, the first African-American leader of an Ivy League, established a committee to talk about Brown's historic association with slavery. A $10 million endowment was done for disadvantaged children in Providence, and also an establishment of partnerships with historically black colleges and universities to provide technical assistance as well as educational exchanges. In 2016, Georgetown University acknowledged that there is the legacy of slavery and its participation because the university in 1838 sold 227 African Americans in order to save the institution from financial ruin. Roughly, the value of the sale today would be $3.5 million. The university issued a formal apology, tracked down the descendants, offered them admission, and last year the student body actually voted to increase their fees by $27.50 to pay for reparations, with the establishment of an endowment for the, I think, 108 descendants of those who were sold into slavery. And finally, on Capitol Hill, let us talk about the HR 40. Let us also talk about the California legislation that will establish a commission to deal with reparations. And Glendale, California becomes the first city in California and the third across the country to really acknowledge and apologize for the racist policy of sundown towns. New Jersey had about 30 of those sundown towns, including but not limited to Bordentown, Mahwah, Cherry Hills, Hamilton Township, Paterson, Tenafly, and Mount Laurel.
Okay.
And I want to end with this song by Trick Daddy. Maybe not the first person that comes to mind when you think of an academic presentation, but he says 4 degrees and a PhD and you still the N-word. Why? Because reparations for slavery is not just for those who are poor. It is for an entire group of people that have been quarantined and relegated to a second-class status. And with Lyndon Johnson, until justice is blind to color, until education is unaware of race, until opportunity is unconcerned with the color of men's skin, emancipation will be a proclamation, but not a fact. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. McCalpin. This is excellent. I already have questions rolling in. So the first question to pop up is, as we approach International Education Week in mid-November, have you given any thought to the role the global world should play, if any, in holding America responsible for reparations to Black people, considering that many of these countries did business with the United States during slavery? So that's the question.
Yeah, I think part of it is that in many ways the United States have recused itself from many of the international covenants that would seek to get some essential punishment or accountability for slavery. I can think of the World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001, where the United States and a few African countries who felt pressured because of aid refused to recognize slavery as a crime against humanity and therefore necessary for compensation. But I think legislation and I think litigation can be brought against some of those companies. What Deidre Farmer Pellman did in 2003, I was hoping would have had a little more momentum in terms of getting us to some of these lawsuits. But it's necessary to explore litigation because within the context of international law, slavery can be thought of as a case of unjust enrichment.
Right. So I'm also wondering thoughts about, so you talked a little bit about the Freedmen's Bureau, what was supposed to happen right after the end of the Civil War.
Right.
What are your thoughts about, kind of Congress re-examining that for today? Like taking a look back at what was established in the Freedmen's Bureau plan and reevaluate that and perhaps even, institute something like that today?
When I thought about it and the Freedmen's Bureau, and I think of what it meant to have robbed African Americans who got a false sense of hope because they settled on these lands very quickly between January and August, and were then summarily told that these lands would be reverted to the Confederate planters and owners who had essentially oppressed them. I think Congress is ripe for that conversation because in many ways what we've seen has been this recalcitrance to honestly interrogate history. I think the Freedmen's Bureau situation, because of the reneging on Field Order 15, should be linked to larger questions of reparations. I noticed it was not very obvious and present last year, June 2019, on Capitol Hill. I don't think a lot of that conversation was held because reparations is not just now looking in a very pigeonhole sense at just slavery. It's also reneging on promises to give African Americans just entitlement through land. I said land was one of the dimensions of reparations. Certainly there is enough land that could have been easily granted and given. That was 400,000 acres from Charleston, South Carolina to the St. Johns River in Jacksonville. Just think of what that could have done to have that black enclave in 2020.
Right, and how that, I often think about where would we be today?
The residual effects, right.
Right, exactly. Let me see, we have a few other questions about your thoughts on, you kind of listed those, what is necessary for reparations, what's included beyond just money.
Right.
So we have a student asking that question in terms of, if we couldn't get all of those things, what do you think would be best for African Americans to receive, or people of African descent?
One of the things I skipped over in the interest of time is this idea that affirmative action and welfare are reparatory, and I am absolutely against that argument because they are not exclusive to Black people, right? Mm-hmm. And most of the primary recipients are not Black people. So when we talk about that aggregation, that can't argue for reparations. I think the minimum standard has to first be historic rectification, accepting and admitting that there has been just enrichment, that though we may not be able to calculate its actual dollar value in a more accurate sense, that African Americans have been subject to continuous policies that have made them second class. And this doesn't matter your economic status, it is that your racial classification is that of someone who is of a second class. And so for me, historical rectification. I've been advocating for a Truth and Reparations Commission because I think in many ways We have produced tomes of documents here in the US dealing with all sorts of minutiae, but we have not produced anything to say this speaks to the government, the federal government's complicity, state government's complicity with slavery. California is doing that reckoning, but California shouldn't be the only state that is doing that reckoning. And so in many ways, we have not had a reckoning. And so many people are quick to dismiss to say slavery happened long ago. But if we think about redlining, if we think about gerrymandering, if we think about restrictive covenants, if we think about sundown towns, if we think about police brutality, if we think about medical experimentation and medical apartheid, if we think about those things, then we realize that they are contemporary manifestations of racism. And so historical rectification, an apology, land redistribution. I am okay if there's no monetary disbursement. If you can have land redistribution, right? If you can have land redistribution, every revolution in the world has been fought because of land. Mm-hmm. Landlessness is critical to our understanding of justice. And I know people are more interested in, okay, everyone's going to get a $5,000 check. But land can be transferred. That is how many persons who have benefited from the transfer of wealth across generations have gotten rich through land.
Right.
400,000 acres were just returned in one fell swoop back to the Confederacy.
Right. Yeah, I want to see if Dr. Murphy or Dr. Honaker has any question for you before I go back to the
Yes,
audience.
thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. McCalpin, for a very powerful discussion. You've given us a lot to think about. And, one of the thoughts that I'm trying to unpack in my mind is, concerning the role of corporations, institutions, and this movement towards or call for reparations. I think there are two camps, right? So either trying to navigate it or avoid it. One is on the end of governance, right? The government. Mm-hmm. And then there are institutions that are then forced to confront, reconcile, deal with their role in slavery. And I think in the slave trade. And I'm wondering what room might there be for broad basing, right, these conversations and connecting both the governmental end of it, right, the politics, as well as the corporations. Because we know that slavery and the trade was carried out through corporations and with the support of these empires, right? So there was a partnership in doing it, but we are having these conversations about the resolution without putting them back.
Connectivity. It's important because that was the point of the litigation that was initiated by, Deidre Farmer Pellman. She looked into her own genealogy, but she was also exploring the reality, going to the New York Historical Society and seeing the many ways in which corporations took out life insurance or took out insurance policies on the enslaved, insuring them as cargo, all of that. So when she brought it against Wachovia and Fleet Boston and Aetna and New York Life was also named, and CSX, what she was essentially arguing, and I don't think it gained as much traction because she brought litigation across 9 states, was the idea that if we think of slavery just as someone having a plantation, that is actually a very small aspect of slavery. Slavery was a corporation. It was a corporation, right? It was an economic machinery that had presidents, that had directors in an informal sense, but it was structured in such a way that profit making was the exclusive ethos of slavery. That's what a corporation does. It is designed to make profit. And so I think part of what we're seeing in social justice protests today also has to infuse this notion of historic injustice. It's not just now talking about Black Lives Matter in the present context of police brutality. It is talking about and within the frame of historic injustice. That many of the corporations that we support have been historically complicit in slavery. They've profited, they've benefited. Every time I see an advertisement for life insurance, I remember some of the testimonies of how blacks were sold policies that were essentially void. There was no coverage, but monies were being collected from them to insure their lives. When they died, their families found out they were all fake policies. Those kinds of complicities have to be punished and have to be given accountability. So I agree. The question of corporatizing this notion of responsibility is very important. That corporations have benefited significantly. They invested in slavery because it was profitable, and even after the end of slavery, they continued to profit through these very nefarious things. Mortgage lenders, banks, financial corporations, they profited because of this kind of corporatization. So certainly I think that is another dimension that needs to be engaged.
Yeah, excellent. We have probably more questions than we have time, but one other question is asking, well, it's twofold. What can African Americans do now to continue to fight for reparations? And what responsibility do white allies have in this fight?
One of the slides that I had to rush over was the question of educating. You first have to educate yourself and then educate others. We also need cross-sectional alliances, which is why I made the argument to be pro-reparations is not to be anti-white. You need persons of all races, creed, classes, religion to support reparations, right? Because everyone that have come to the United States after African Americans have benefited from the labor of African Americans, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about the law of historic continuity, there's no building of the very prisons, there's no building of the interstate, there's no building of many of the structures, including those that were established to commemorate racist demagogues. They were built by black people. And so the very infrastructure of this country was built by blacks. And so I don't want people to think of reparations as a black issue. It is a justice issue, and justice should have no color, right? And that's what Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision was when he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? So we have to understand these intersections, that we are people first, and that those who love justice should love reparations. Not to give undeserving people, but there's only one justification necessary for a reparation. A historic wrong or a series of historic wrongs were done. It's not the morality of the victim. It's not the economic status of the victim. It is that the wrong was done. So we need cross-sectional alliances.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, because a lot of people who are, against this idea also talk about, oh, well, what about those who have committed crimes? And what about, but that's not the question to judge. Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Honecker, did you have a question before we wrap up?
No, I have one, but I think I'll just save it. Maybe I will. I wanted to connect it to Red Summer and talk about the
Red Summer of 1919.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a presentation on it later in the week. Wendell White is doing a presentation on his photographic series on Red Summer. And we saw things in Tulsa, so that when even Black citizens were able to accumulate wealth and to somehow take advantage of these structures, they were then punished and massacred for doing so. So I don't know if there's a question in there. I just wanted to.
But that's an important connection, because the history, and it is problematically called race riots, because it's really racial terror, right? Because whites set upon blacks and essentially terrorized them. So it wasn't a riot in the way we understand riots in the 21st century, because when we think of Elaine in Arkansas, when we think of Tulsa, when we think of Rosewood, when we think of Wilmington in 1898, where African Americans were on course to become political leaders, that the Democratic Party essentially usurped that by intimidating them and burning down their places. Tulsa, 16 blocks of black wealth, of black promise, was leveled to the ground and almost forgotten by history. So reparations also includes the reality that even when blacks in America sought to do things as a result of their own industry, they were essentially violated. Most of the lynching across the North and the South was also this way of keeping blacks in their place. That don't aspire to be great, don't aspire to be economically well, because ultimately racial terror kept blacks in their place.
Right.
Well, thank you. I'm
Absolutely.
glad I got to ask my question.
Thank you so much. We also have a lot of comments just saying thank you for a very, very thorough and enlightening.
There was one that I remembered. I glimpsed on the chat and I wanted to answer the student because I quoted the song. The student said, "What do I think about the use of the N-word?" And I will just
Oh, okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
It is problematic. You can't divorce the reality of the racism of the term from any usage. So you can't sanitize the term. All right? The reality of it is that people use it, but it was once used as a term of demeaning. It was one of oppression. It was one of negation and abnegation of humanity. And so the term is not acceptable by anyone. It can't be sanitized. It can't be a term of endearment. It can't be a term of confraternity. It is a problematic term because it is tied to a problematic history of slavery. Whites should not use it, certainly, but I don't think that anyone should use it, given its relationship to a very difficult and problematic part of our history that continues into the present. The word should not be used, much in the same way that many of the words in our nomenclature should not be used because they tie blackness to negativity. And I don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to not use the term black male or black sheep or blacklist, because they've been tied to a history where words have been used to oppress people of color.
Yeah, excellent point. Okay, thank you so much. And this has been recorded and it will be sent out for those who want to share this excellent presentation with others that you know. So thank you so much for participating.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. McCalpin.
My pleasure.